My name is Richard, and I'm the Vice President of ESSA at the University of Melbourne. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome you to the 5th Annual Great Economic Debate. Tonight we have assembled here the great debating titans from both Monash University and the University of Melbourne to put their wits to the test and settle once and for all which campus is home to the fiercest minds. If you're a veteran of this event, there's a good chance you've bared witness to Melbourne's rather unfortunate losing streak. However, something tells me that tonight is the night where Melbourne finally turns the competition around. If you're new, then please allow me to introduce our society and this great event. ESSA is one of the largest economic societies of its kind in Australia, with a presence that spans across both the University of Melbourne and Monash University. This year, we're excited to welcome a new branch to our family, the Monash University Caulfield campus. It is our vision to provide a platform for students to engage in economic discussion and create a better informed student body with regards to economic, social, and political issues. With this in mind, I would now like to pass on to Joe, who's part of ESSA Monash's events team, to introduce to you the debate tonight.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joe, and I'm your host for today's economic debate. A special thanks and warm welcome to our expert judges, Senior Lecturer Dr. Simon Angus from Monash University, Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics at Melbourne University, Professor Paul Jensen, and Senior Representative of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Melbourne branch, Tom Rosewall. A warm round of applause, please, for their kind attendance at our debate. A special thank you to our sponsor, Suresh Moody from Strategy And. Now, tonight's topic is Australia cannot maintain its 26-year-long record of economic growth unless it significantly changes its domestic energy mix. From Melbourne University, arguing against, please welcome Priyanka Banerjee. James Maccarone, and Tom Crowley. From Monash Uni, arguing against, please welcome Anthony Antoniadis, Hugh Oliver, and Mary Pirozek. Thank you to the brave students from both sides tonight for their courage in fighting for the university in this intense war of words and ideas tonight. After the main debate has finished, we will open our online polls where you can vote on which team you thought won the debate, who you thought the best speaker was, and what the mini debate topic will be. So the mini debate is, there will be 3 funny topics to choose from, and once the topic has been decided, the teams will nominate 1 member from each side to debate the mini topic, whilst the judges are deliberating. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the first speaker from Melbourne arguing for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, energy is crucial in Australia, not only in and of itself as the energy sector and how important that is, but also as a key and primary input into some of the most important industries in Australia's economy, namely that of mining, transportation, construction, to name a few. But what an economy or Australia without a significant change in its energy policy and its energy mix looks like is a continued protectionism towards fossil fuels and towards traditional energies and energy sources which lock Australia in to an economy and an economic system that actively hampers our ability to continue to grow over the next short run, but also long term, and ultimately jeopardizing our consistent trajectory so far in terms of maintaining a time without any economic recession over the past 26 years. So firstly, how does this sort of characterise as the energy system as an input to the Australian macroeconomy? So in terms of laying out the landscape, right? So more than 3/4 of Australia's current energy is sourced from things like oil, gas, and coal. And so all of these sources have worked well historically throughout the 20th century, but we've seen a growing trend towards technologies, for example, renewables, that are able to achieve clean and efficient power generation that's going to be able to support the electricity industry, one of the major industries within Australia, but also all of the key components of that economy. And so why it's particularly important is because what the Monash team today needs to maintain in order to have insignificant change is essentially maintaining the current trajectory. And ladies and gentlemen, that's simply insufficient. Because what that means is it means we won't be meeting our Paris Agreement negotiation targets that we have committed to. It means things like we're going to be continuing to endorse an inefficient system that's just not going to deliver the economic growth that we need in order to support a growing and more diverse population in cleaner and in better ways. And then what does the status quo then look like for the electricity system and electricity generation? So we see that currently there's significant concerns around reliability of power and the fact that there's major underinvestment, almost in the order of about $500 billion across South Australia and Victoria predominantly. And what that's meant is that we've seen these sort of events over the past sort of 24 months, which have compromised Australia's economy by not being able to support that energy mix through current measures. And what we need is that currently the environment is one of political stasis, which lacks any credible investment from private sector in terms of the key energy infrastructure that we need in order to support this. And the current pathway, again, is insufficient to be able to meet these growing energy demands. So this has been modelling, for example, by the RBA, which has shown that without significant change to the infrastructure and to the system itself, we're simply not going to be able to meet the requirements of a more modern Australian economy. So then what we're going to look at is firstly sort of the investment benefits itself to the macro policy environment, and then moving on to this pure technology benefits of enacting a significant change. So onto the first one. So what are the key investment benefits? So there's sort of twofold. So this is the first order sort of direct effect predominantly, which is the fact that this infrastructure is crucial. When we have agencies like the Business Council of Australia, with Jennifer Westacott, for example, stating that the reason for this underinvestment largely is driven by this political uncertainty and the fact that no one's really willing to commit to significant change. The mechanism by which we achieve that is something that is in the order of a market-based, flexible, technology-neutral scheme. We're not going to specify like it has to be a particular way, but for illustration purposes, something like an emissions trading scheme is going to suffice, but noting that the mechanism itself is out of tonight's debate. But what we actually see under the status quo is this high volatility because we don't have the appropriate infrastructure within our generation system. And so that's creating this massive shortfall. And what it means is that there is a clear scope that if we're going to be in a position as the government and as broader society in order to create the incentives for major change, in order to being able to incentivize this investment. So for private stakeholders right now, they're going to have the certainty that we are transitioning to a majorly different energy system that is going to honour the fact that they are now investing millions of dollars in storage technologies, in better wind, in solar thermal, in up-and-coming new technologies that are going to enable the system to meet the reliability requirements, but will do that in a way that is clean and efficient and supports the economic activity itself. And then more importantly as well, the investment is crucial because currently the sort of economy is characterised in a setting where we have quite low levels of business investment, which is not quite recovered from the post-mining boom time, where it experienced that significant growth from business investment. So this represents a key opportunity for Australia to capitalise on this issue in this energy sector and actually promote significant change in order to affect investment climates. And then further, how can this affect it through the electricity sector? Now, we know, as I flagged, that there's a clear flow through from electricity generation and how it feeds into key industries like mining, like transport, like agriculture, for instance. And we're in a society at the moment that's experiencing significant increases in power prices. Now, absenting the fact that there is clear monopoly power being exercised in the retail space, one of the key drivers that as policymakers you can directly affect are wholesale prices. And what's one of the key ways to do that is to promote technologies like solar, like wind, which are able to provide energy at really low marginal costs. And so when you promote not only those technologies, but also technologies that directly address the intermittency aspects of things like storage, what it means that you don't need dirty sources to be the marginal plant. It means you shift your merit order curve, so how wholesale prices are determined, towards technologies that are really, really cheap, where it basically is just free from the sun and from natural elements. And so that's a key driver into retail prices absenting market power. So that's a really important aspect, and it's something that's been flagged by the recent Finkel review, where investment in these areas is key to be driving down these wholesale prices. And so what that's going to then mean is it's going to enable the competitiveness of Australian industry, which is so crucial. But then also, the technologies themselves are important, because particularly for medium to long-term economic growth, which we're also interested in this debate, is that by not retaining historic energy standards, so things like maintaining 50% coal and oil and gas, that we're going to be able to actually push the technology frontier, build up a comparative advantage in these technologies that is going to mean that Australia is in a position to maintain its economic growth over the next decades to come. And it's going to be promoting allocative and dynamic efficiencies throughout the economy in order to promote resource flexibility, which is going to be achieved under a sort of technology neutral mechanism, which is internalising those market failures that are characteristic of the broader climate change problem, right? So further from that, there's also sort of a moral aspect to this, which is that in order to meet these economic growth targets, that participating in a strong manner from Australia is going to mean that there is a more cooperative aspect to the whole climate change game, essentially, right? Because it's going to generate buy-in from other countries that's going to make sure that, even if Australia is a small player, other countries are also invested. And it's going to mean that those irreversible climate change benefits aren't going to be so severe in impacting future long-run economic growth. And especially given that we've had historical reviews like the Garno, for example, which has predicted that GDP will be decreasing by in the order of about 5% due to catastrophic climate change. This is an important imperative, economically speaking, to be acting on right now, to be making sure that we're shifting the energy mix in the right direction in the significant way to promote the appropriate technologies that are going to make sure that Australia is at the forefront of these technologies and at the forefront of making sure that economic growth is on a continued positive track over the next decades to come. Ladies and gentlemen, energy is crucial to Australia. The only way that the continued energy mix is going to serve us is simply an extension of the existing protectionism of the energy mix already under the status quo.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me be clear from the outset. At the core of this topic, we need to ask ourselves, can Australia only maintain its 26-year record of consecutive economic growth if it significantly changes the energy mix? The question is not about changing the energy mix to maintain economic growth 10 years from now. It's not about maintaining economic growth 20 years from now. It's not about maintaining economic growth 40 years from now. It's about maintaining consecutive growth right now. Okay, so as the first speaker for the negative team, I will address this topic in 3 parts. First, I will look at Australia's economic growth over the past 26 years and how it has been driven by factors more decisive than our energy mix. Second, and extending on my first point, I will argue that it is these very same factors that will drive our economic growth into the future. And finally, I will argue that it is not possible to significantly change our energy mix without negatively affecting our 26-year streak of consecutive economic growth. Our second speaker, Anthony Antoniadis, will then expand on why we need to focus on these alternative proven drivers of economic growth. And finally, Mary will summarise our speech and determinatively prove why our case is stronger. So moving on to point 1. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take you through our 26-year history of economic growth. And the reason I'm doing this is so that you can see that our historical economic growth is a product of many factors, and by no means is the energy mix decisive. If you ask any economist, they will tell you that our strong growth has been driven by a number of things. 1, broad-based deregulation of financial, labour and product markets. 2, further liberalisation of international trade. 3, sustained commitments to maintaining a pro-competitive landscape. 4, an unprecedented mining boom driven by strong iron ore and coal prices. 5, technological process. 6, the expansion of our service-based economy. And this leads me to my second point. Those very same factors are going to drive, support and sustain our economic growth in the coming years. Factors such as maintaining a robust pro-competitive landscape, focusing on productivity-enhancing reform, minimising tax distortions, improving the efficiency of infrastructure. It's these factors that are going to drive, support and sustain our economic growth. And that's something our second speaker will expand on in more detail in his speech. Yes, I don't dispute that the energy mix is important, but it is not as decisive as this combination of factors. And this brings me to my third and final point. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not possible to significantly change our energy mix without seriously jeopardising our 26-year-long consecutive period of economic growth. And that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, significantly changing our energy mix to include renewables, such as solar, such as wind, is not feasible at this stage in time. There are many well-known technical issues with renewable energy. The fact is that the sun is not always shining, the wind is not always blowing, and right now we haven't developed sufficient technologies to capture and store that energy for times when it's most needed. So if we significantly change our energy mix right now, that would have a negative effect on business confidence, that would have a negative effect on business investment, and that's going to have a negative effect on economic growth. The second point is that significantly changing our energy mix is incredibly expensive. The only way to currently meet our energy needs by significantly changing our mix is to have an expansive, broad mix of energy, so solar, geothermal, hydro, wind. Now, because Australia's population is spread over an extensive geographical landmass, we cannot efficiently transport renewable energy over large distances. When more and more solar and wind energy is connected to the electricity grid, that means we have to install expensive equipment to maintain consistency and stability in the energy output, and that is incredibly, incredibly expensive. In contrast, European countries that do have more renewable-based energy mixes, such as Germany, such as France, such as Iceland, have a much higher population density, and therefore, as a direct result, they are able to transport renewable energy more cost-effectively to the end user. So because of these astronomical costs, the only way this would be cost-effective is through government subsidies. And the fact is that is money the government cannot and will not spend. And so ultimately, if we tried to change the energy mix right now, that would lead to higher energy prices. And we know that higher energy prices are bad for economic growth from both a consumption and a production perspective. So in summary, let me be clear. I'm not saying that the current system is perfect. There are limitations to our current energy mix, in particular our heavy reliance on fossil fuels. We agree that the energy mix must eventually change. We don't dispute that fact. But remember, tonight's debate is about whether we can maintain our 26-year consecutive period of economic growth without significantly changing our energy mix. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have established that economic growth is driven by more factors than simply the energy mix. We have also established that we cannot significantly change our energy mix right now without significant costs. And if you accept those 2 propositions, then you have to accept that Australia can and will maintain its 26-year consecutive period of economic growth without significantly changing the energy mix. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately for the previous speaker, this debate is definitely about the effects of an energy mix on economic growth. And so whilst we don't dispute the fact that other factors have contributed historically to Australia's economic growth, the key clash in this debate, if we're going to have one, is about whether if we change the energy mix in Australia, which currently sits at about 1/3 from coal, 1/3 from oil, like 1/4 from gas, and like 6% from renewables, whether changing that makes it more or less likely for us as a country to maintain economic growth. It is our contention as an affirmative team tonight
that if you change that energy mix and allow the market to change the energy mix towards one which is cleaner, towards one which reduces our energy emissions by 26 to 28% on 2005 levels, as we've signed up to in the Paris Agreement, that you're more likely on our side of the debate to actually get real economic growth. So we didn't think it was like quite fair in this debate to say like, oh, a whole host of other things matter as well. Like clearly, this debate is clearly about whether energy actually affects economic growth. So having established that, let's go through a few things that we didn't hear responses to from the previous team that we thought were really important in this debate. Priyanka's first point, just to reiterate it, was that in the short run, there is a huge investment boom in allowing clean energies to flourish in Australia. Why is that true? The Finkel Review, which was recently handed down, found that there was a $500 billion investment in generation capacity deficit in Australia because investors wanted to invest in clean energy, but political stasis and confusion meant that they couldn't because they didn't know what the policy was. As a team, we say that because we support something like an ETS or some other decisive government measure to enact the change in energy mix to be clean, we get firstly a short-run stimulus from the amount of investment in generation, in wholesale activity, in generation that will occur in Australia. That's not me coming up with that figure, that's Alan Finkel, specifically in South Australia and in Victoria. So the second thing that Priyanka told you was that has a second order effect by decreasing the volatility of energy wholesale prices, which we've seen have been a major source of concern, particularly as an input into things like manufacturing, which represent 20% of the consumption of energy in Australia. When you are a manufacturing plant and you can't plan that my power prices are not going to be $1,000 per second, then clearly that has a massive economic effect on the economy as a whole. And like that's absenting just like the flow through effects. We'd love to hear a great response to that from the opposition. The other things that Hugh said, which were really interesting, was firstly that renewables are not feasible in Australia, because he said that the first reason he had for this was that the sun is not always shining. Okay, so the trite response to that is like, it's literally Australia. The sun is always shining somewhere. But like, that's not a response in this debate. More importantly, storage technologies have dramatically improved and continue to do so. We need not only to point to examples such as Elon Musk investing in a huge battery in South Australia recently for evidence of that, but more importantly, we think that if the market demand is there, the government creates the incentives for investors and entrepreneurs to come up with new technologies, that the market itself will generate these ideas. I don't think any of us on that side of the team have any idea about the engineering qualities of storage, right? It's just that like when the incentives are out there, the market will generate these ideas so that you do get that investment and you do get those technologies being made. The other thing was he pointed, like sort of alluded to this idea that like because it's intermittent or something that it can't sustain Australia's energy mix. That's what the 49 of the 50 recommendations of the Finkel Review were talking about when they looked at energy security, right? Particularly investment in interconnectors between South Australia and Victoria, or Victoria and Tasmania on the national electricity market. Because when one of those goes down, like sure as hell, there's no electricity going to those places when there's a storm, which is exactly what happened. It was quite like unrelated in general to renewables as a source of generation. Okay, the second thing that he said there was that Australia is so big, so you can't transport energy around. That's just not true. The reason why that's not true is because when you create incentives for private companies, like through feed-in tariffs, etc., to invest in the technologies that will generate that clean electricity, we absolutely think the distribution network can handle it. Okay, so the other points which they didn't really try to respond to, which we thought were critical actually, and maybe even the main points of this debate, was like Ross Garnaut conducted a series of reviews, one starting in 2008, 2011, where he showed through like CGE modelling that Australia's GDP would be literally 5% lower if we didn't take dramatic intervention in the market to alleviate climate change. Why is that true? What sort of methodology did he come up with there? Well, he said that catastrophic climate change is particularly harmful for Australia's growth. I mean, it's pretty self-evident, but some transmission mechanisms might include the fact that when like a storm comes and wipes out a city and the entire capital stock, it's really hard to sustain your standard of living. When, for example, there's like bushfires raging in regional communities, that's probably going to also wipe out employment in those areas. So clearly, like, the marginal effect of Australia taking some action in global emissions is not going to do a huge deal. Where we see the biggest amount of effort come in is that we see climate change as some sort of collective action problem. In less developed countries such as Australia, in agreements such as Paris, unlike the US, decide to commit to their targets, commit to the 26 to 28%, you are unlikely to see that type of global reduction in emissions. And therefore, if that's less likely to occur, you're more likely to suffer the extreme effects of climate change, thereby wiping out Australia's economic growth to 2100, which is what he modelled to. So that's like another mechanism which we think is really important, and I'm not sure Hugh actually addressed it. The final thing to say before I sit down, because you've all heard enough of me, is this idea of technology neutrality. Basically, the topic says that we can't maintain economic growth unless it significantly changes its domestic energy mix. Another way of reading that is they have to defend why not significantly changing our energy mix would be more likely to generate economic growth. We think that's a fair reading of the topic. So if that's true, then why would they be happy to say, for example, that we have to always maintain a third, a quarter, a sixth, or 6% for the energy mix that I outlined at the start? We think that's like the alarm bells of any economist should be going off when you say that what we have now as an energy mix forever shall be the best and most efficient source of energy. In fact, what we say is that because we know that negative externalities exist, we're happy to let the market decide how we achieve the reductions. We just know sure as hell we need to if we're going to get the economic growth in the long run, as Garno said. So, because a lot of people are a lot wiser than me on this topic, like Finkel, like Garno, like every intergovernmental panel on climate change, I'm very happy to propose. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm kind of sad. I had a fantastic speech I was going to write. I was going to go through all these really interesting points that was going to deal with the topic. Alas, it turns out the affirmative needs a solid lesson in reading comprehension and Australia's energy grid. So let's go back and peel it all the way back to our fundamental basics. I know this sounds condescending and I'd hate to do this, but here I am doing it anyway. I'm going to have to read to us the topic. Australia cannot maintain its 26-year-long record of economic growth unless it significantly changes its domestic energy mix. Let's think about this. Let's break this down. What is it implying? Now, what is it explicitly saying? It is saying that we must change. You know what? No, I'm putting it a different way. It's saying that if we do not change it, we will not have this record. This necessarily implies a short-term thing. That's what streaks are. That's why when you're playing Mario Kart and you mess something off and you're annoyed, it's a combo breaker. One thing breaks the chain. This is what we are talking about, ladies and gentlemen. We are not talking about 100, 50, 20 years from now. We are reading this, not just literally, but reading this sensically. Now, I know this sounds pedantic, so I'm going to actually put that aside and not deal with that per se, and I'm going to deal with the greater issue here, because I do think that is a much more interesting debate for us to all deal with. Now, there was talks of more likely to. This came up a few times. This is interesting. We're not talking about more likely to. We're not sitting here in the realm of probabilities. We're going to look back and look at what has caused our growth, what is causing our growth, and how and why this may change. And we're going to see some interesting things. Now, I'm going to return to that in a little bit because I've got some nice stuff I want to talk about, but we'll deal with the second issue, and that is whether or not we're understanding what an energy mix is here. Can anyone raise their hand and tell me if they know right now the difference between an energy mix and an electricity industry? Raise your hand if you get this distinction. Okay, fascinating. To put it simply so we can all be clear, the energy mix refers to all sources of energy. The electricity industry and the electricity mix is where our electricity comes from. Great. Let's explore Australia's electricity grid. Hugh so well put that we have a unique electricity grid. Unique. You talk to any electrical engineer and they will start talking about words like redundant systems, parallel systems. They'll refer to the fact that we're all on our eastern seaboard. They'll talk about square inverse laws of sending electricity over large distances and the need to amplify it, and your eyes will glaze over. What about this? The difference between 50.1 and 49.9 seems insignificant, doesn't it? Not if you're an electrical engineer interested in renewable energy. It turns out there are things called electricity takers and makers, or followers and leaders. It's the same stuff. Now, renewable energy producers are followers or takers, to use the jargon of the industry. If I set up solar panels, if I make beautiful wind turbines, they will take whatever the grid does. This is what caused the issue in South Australia. Not grappling with this and using erudite, pithy statements, unfortunately, tarnishes over the whole discussion. If you set up something that only follows, it goes and goes and goes until the system shuts down and we get a South Australia, we get a Tasmania. So these issues are very important. So saying Australia isn't unique, it sadly breaks my heart because we miss the fundamental issue. So now that we've got all this clear, all this boring technical jargon which we'd all rather forget about, let's now get into it. So Australia does not need to significantly change its domestic energy mix in order to achieve economic growth. This is my central premise. I'll be delivering 3 points to satisfy this, or to state this. Number one, our economy has grown through a diverse range of industries growing under prudential regulation. My second point, Australia's energy mix is a small part of our economy and our energy sector is one of our slowest growing. And my third point is that Australia's growth has not been drastic per se, but rather consistent, and this is fundamental. So let's look at our first thing. If everyone else is not growing for 26 years straight, but we are, what do we have to look at? Do we look at what causes growth? Yes, but we don't just look at what causes growth, we look at what causes recessions. Because if we're setting records and everyone's growing most of the time, the reason everyone else isn't setting records is because they are not growing all the time. That's the fundamental distinction. So the easiest place to look to identify this is what causes people to stop growing, to step backwards, to be that combo breaker. Recessions, yay, economics term. So let's look at the first big recession that comes to mind, the GFC. Sorry again to get a little technical, but what caused the GFC? To put it simply, subprime lending and securitization. Basically, you get people with no income, no assets, no jobs, ninja loans, you start selling them houses, you package them up into big tranches and securitize things and you sell them off, and it's not great. Australia, however, we should have had this happen because we had the same 80s and 90s legal changes that America and Europe did. In Europe, in the United States, in the 80s and 90s, there was all this financial deregulation. It was basically carte blanche for the banks. It was fantastic. The US got drunk on it. They accidentally spread this to Europe. It got out of control. And Australia dodged it. Why? Well, thankfully, we have great people over at APRA and great banks that do their own self-regulation. The ACCC, they did their job well. Basically, we had great prudential regulation that kept us not growing too quickly at any one time, but rather growing consistently. For this reason, we did not have heaps of people default on mortgages, hundreds of thousands of houses going up for sale every day. What was happening was that we grew steadily every single year and we did not fall into recession. For that reason, we kept our economic growth. But banking is one example, and this is central to what I'm getting at here. There are many industries in Australia that are more productive than similar nations. And this diversity of industries together causes our growth. To give you a great example, agribusiness. Probably many of us don't really know it well, but it turns out it's Australia's most comparatively productive industry. Other ones are wealth management, financial services, insurance, even oil and gas, I will give it that. But the key issue is this. We are productive year in, year out at only a few percent, but enough to dodge recession because we have prudent laws allowing us to grow consistently. So I'm going to move on to my second point for the sake of time. Australia's energy mix is only a small part of our economy and one of the slowest growing. If we were listening to the affirmative narrative that they're painting, this dreamland situation where Elon Musk can fly in and drop batteries to everyone, we would start thinking that there's this bedrock of Australia that is our energy mix. So let's look at the facts. Well, for one, I'm not going to lie, oil and gas is actually a pretty good industry in Australia to invest in. It's 20% more productive than than the same industries in other countries. I'm proud of that, you should be proud of that. But here's the thing, it's only 2.8% of our gross value added. That is output. That's like our income, for those who want to put it simply. And if oil, gas, and other things like that were so fundamental, if their prices were so important, if they go up a little bit and we're all going to start losing value as the affirmative claims, then we should see Victoria as behind Australia by 21%. Why 21%? Because Victoria's energy prices are 21% more expensive than the cheapest alternative in any other state. But what are the facts and figures? Well, we're growing at 3%. Go away, Mum. We're growing at 3.3% per annum. That's faster than most of Australia. So what's the point? Well, obviously, we're not reliant on these industries. We're not relying on the price of oil and gas. What we are reliant on is our diverse businesses growing slowly, growing steadily, and this makes all the difference. Now, I'm not saying renewables have no place in Australia. No one would say that. That's why it's not politically savvy against what the affirmative are saying. It's going to be 10% by 2035 of our energy mix in renewables. And for that point, I am proud to stand for the negative argument where we are in reality. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anthony. It's very noble of you to put aside a very nicely written speech to teach us all a few things. I'm sure everyone here appreciates it. But let me see if I can try and explain your argument sensibly. As far as I can understand, there are two parts to the argument we've heard from the negative team. Part number one, renewables are bad. Part number two, renewables don't matter anyway because they didn't used to matter. Now, I'm going to take these kind of one at a time. I think James has dealt with the first one in large part, so I'll try not to spend too much time on it. But I do want to go back over this kind of argument about the effect that changing the mix towards renewables significantly will have on our economy. Because when we hear these lines like the sun don't shine and the wind don't blow, we hear these time and time again in discussions about climate change. And I can tell you what, if I had a PhD in climate science, I'm sure I'd be well and truly sick of people reducing my entire academic work to a slogan like that. But I suppose part of the reason that these ideas persist so much in the public debate is that when you hear something like that, you think, well, yeah, it sounds right. The sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. Maybe renewables can't achieve baseload power. Now, just like James, I'm not going to engage in a discussion about technology. I'm certainly not qualified to do that. But what I will say is that the experts are very clear that baseload power can be achieved by renewables in Australia. The storage capacity does exist, and the problem with blackouts in South Australia, like we saw last year, the problem was simply that the storage capacity was not yet up to scratch. And that in the national electricity market, which spans multiple states, the ability to deal with periods of peak demand was just not there. And one of the key insights of the Finkel Review, one of the main things that the Finkel Review set out to do, was to put in place the proper safeguards to make sure that something like that couldn't happen again. And although not all of Finkel was agreed to, 49 out of 50 recommendations in Finkel were agreed to on day one by all the states and the Commonwealth. And in those 49 recommendations were a bunch of reforms to safeguard our electricity system and to make sure that as we move the mix towards renewables, renewables can keep up and can provide baseload power. So I think it's really, really important to dispel the kind of catchy slogans that people who are arguing against renewables often use. It's just not true. And if you want to look for another reason that it's just not true, look to the market. Because what we're seeing at the moment, and this is what the affirmative team has been emphasising over and over again, that what we're actually seeing is a market that is itching to invest in renewables. The market understands that renewables are ready to provide a significantly greater percentage of Australia's energy needs than they do now. And the only reason that the market has been held back to the extent that it has is basically because of the frustrating political debate that we've seen in this country over the last 10 years, and which unfortunately has infected the rhetoric of some of our speakers tonight. It's politics that is standing in the way of investment certainty. The market is itching to embrace renewables, and an emissions trading scheme or some sort of similar mechanism, a clear signal from the government that what the market wants to do, which is investing in renewables, will be met with certainty from the government, will guarantee energy security going forward, and does allow our economy to do what it wants to do, which is pursue the sort of significant mix that we're talking about. So I have indeed read the topic, and when I read this topic, what I see is something that is almost inevitable, and the only thing that is standing in the way of this significant mix is currently the government making its attempts through projects like the Adani coal mine to prop up a dying coal industry. And in some sense, the model that Priyanka outlined in her speech is exactly about addressing this and exactly about dealing with this. There are a few other parts to the renewable debate that I'll sort of touch on briefly. I mean, they mentioned Power prices, it's worth pointing out that power prices are again one of these often debated and little understood things, but that a lot of the empirical evidence shows that one of the major determinants of power prices is unwieldy market power on behalf of the big players, and a lot of confusion that causes for consumers who can't get the best deal. So there are a bunch of there's a lot of sort of, I suppose, noise in the pricing of power. And so again, I think that the claim from the negative team that power prices would go up as a result of an ETS, particularly when you consider the low marginal cost that Priyanka's already pointed out renewables bring along, I think again it's pretty clear that claim is not credible. So, I mean, I suppose they're the things that I'll point out about why renewables are not bad, why we are ready to embrace renewables and move forward to this significant change. But I now want to deal with this other part of the negative team's argument, where they talk about the fact that renewables don't matter essentially because they haven't mattered in the last 26 years. Now, first of all, I mean, I shouldn't have to point out in a debate like this that to understand Australia's macroeconomic future, looking to the past is necessary but not sufficient. And it's not enough simply to look at the things that happened over the last 26 years, like the mining boom, and say that those things will carry us forward into the future. It's exactly that sort of complacency that policymakers and policy experts have been warning us against for the last 10 years. While the mining boom was going on, in fact, they were saying, look to the next challenge. What's lurking over the horizon? What's going to threaten our growth next? And how can we be ready for it? And what were they warning us about? They were warning us about climate change. The Garnaut Review came out for the first time, I believe, in 2008, and I think again in 2011. Warnings about climate change have been around for much longer than that. In other words, over the last 26 years, people had been warning us this would be a challenge that was coming. And we're now moving to the point where it's no longer the time for warnings, now is the time for consequences. And I promised myself I wouldn't do this, but I am going to make a Game of Thrones reference, perhaps because I saw the latest episode today and it's stuck in my head, but I can't help but see this argument from the negative team as Cersei Lannister's argument against the White Walkers. For several seasons, I'm sorry for anyone who hasn't seen Game of Thrones, but anyone who was kind of watching the show in the first few seasons might have said, oh, this big threat of the White Walkers, we don't need to worry about it, it's off in the distance. Now, winter is coming, the challenge is upon us, and the threat that people have been talking about and not being believed about is coming now. And so, yes, the past 26 years, renewables may not have played a significant part in Australia's economic growth. But that means, in no way does that mean that it will not play a significant part in the future. And looking to the past is, I suppose, a myopic way to talk about growth. I'm not going to get bogged down in the sort of figures about what is the single sole determinant of Australia's great macroeconomic performance over the last 26 years. But what I will simply say is that it is pretty clear from the wording of this topic that we are talking about what is important for Australia's growth future in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And again, this is something that our team has tried to make very clear tonight. In the short term, there are reasons to expect that allowing the market to do what it wants to do and invest in renewables will be a good thing. It will allow new investment. We're taking the government out of this kind of business of protectionism and into the business of stimulating new investment. That's a good thing in the short term. Garnaut in 2008, in fact, predicted that the cost to growth over the short term would only be 0.1% of the growth rate a year. Not enough to cause a recession, certainly. So in the short term, we actually believe there are some benefits and the costs are not great. And in the medium to the long term, it could not be clearer. With the threat of climate change having been spoken about for the last 26 years and beyond, time for action was yesterday, but certainly if we fail to act now, Australia's growth record in the short term, the medium term and the long term are clearly at risk. So however you want to read tonight's topic, the time for a significant change is well and truly upon us.
Ladies and gentlemen, we had an affirmative team here today that suffered from a case of optimism. To use their Game of Thrones analysis, they're the sort of people who think all you need are Dany's dragons to defeat the White Walkers and the army of the dead coming. They thought that they didn't have to talk about technology in this debate when this was incredibly important to the ability of Australians and Australian investment to actually sustain its growth and have reliability of energy and power. And secondly, they thought that they could just rely on name-dropping reports rather than using actual logic in this debate. So a few key points. Firstly, the harms of a quick change to renewable energy in the switch from supporting fossil fuels. Secondly, on the reliability of renewable energies and the harms that the unreliability will bring. And then lastly, a point on climate change now and into the future. So firstly, on the mechanism from switching support for fossil fuels. What the affirmative team failed to recognise in this debate are that fossil fuels actually contain the backbone of Australian economy. That's one of the things that we pointed out from the very first speaker, where the mining boom was one of the things that sustained us through the GFC. But a few extra points here. Firstly, mining and export of coal is a main aspect of our economy, especially exporting energy to China. Despite their switch to somewhat renewable resources, our investment in fossil fuels, both for our domestic energy mix, also fuels our drive for exports further. But then secondly, mining and the generation of this energy is a significant aspect of our Australian employment and is a great chance of investment with large returns, as our second speaker said. So withdrawing subsidies from fossil fuels and withdrawing our support from fossil fuels, especially in the immediate term, was going to always have incredibly significant results. So especially two key ones. Firstly, power prices are likely to go up, and I'll expand on this later when I talk about the unreliability of renewable energy, especially as when we remove subsidies from coal, which makes up the main baseload energy within Australia, it means that price will have to be borne now by consumers who will now have less capitals to spend in the other aspects of our economy, especially when we told you that the service-based economy was incredibly important in Australia. But then secondly, what it would do was lower business confidence and lower business investment in this. Because as we told you from second, this was one of the things that yielded the most returns to business and was best able to fuel our economy further, especially from top to bottom. Because when you then took away support from these fossil fuels that businesses and other stakeholders had invested so heavily in, their confidence would obviously be reduced, and they would have to either garner the lowered returns or withdraw their support entirely. So it had absolute immediate effects. And then thirdly, like the lack of employment, people would have to become unemployed as they were no longer able to be supported. So that was going to have immediate tangible effects that the affirmative never wanted to deal with in this debate. But this brings me to my second and probably most pertinent point, the reliability of renewable energies. Now, while they didn't want to talk about technology, let's use some of their examples against them. The technology is simply not there. Firstly, they wanted to say, okay, the sun is always shining, but that doesn't remove the aspect that while individual solar panels rely purely on the daylight and wind farms rely on when the wind is blowing. And they wanted to say that the storage capacity was there to overcome these intermittent issues and refer to Elon Musk's battery as the best source of proving that the storage capacity was there. Clearly, they haven't read up on Elon Musk's battery in South Australia, because firstly, while this was an incredibly expensive endeavour, and secondly is the very top of technology, the most that it is capable of doing, even within the very small energy demands of the South Australian energy market, is to deal with only the micro fluctuations. All it could do is, when a baseload energy was insufficient, deal with if there was a thunderstorm or that some sort of thing that was going to impact those further energy resources. So if this is the very top of technology, clearly the technology is not there, especially when they wanted to characterize our energy demands as going up in future. So what this was always going to lead to was those volatile energy prices and the issues for manufacturing that they wanted to say was so important in this debate. When you have an unreliable source of energy, then you will also have unreliable prices of energy, because you do not know how much of it you currently have to supply that demand. So when you had that unreliable technology, those volatile prices were only ever going to get worse than the stable coal generators that you knew were always going to have that base load of energy. So the manufacturing companies who were going to suffer from this were going to suffer more. But say we could get technology to that place. Firstly, you would need absolutely massive investment to get it there. And this means you would have to sink loads of capital, both at a government level and at a business level. This is particularly important because it actually was going to drive the prices of that energy in future. Because if you're going to sink a lot of capital into something that you think is going to have like lower energy costs, that doesn't yield much return to you as a business. You are not going to make money off that. It actually incentivized the creation of monopolies over this sort of renewable energy so that you could have the higher energy prices and make returns off your investment. I didn't think that any businesses out there were so optimistic and willing and giving to sink millions of dollars into something they thought they weren't going to get many returns off. The other alternative to those incredibly high energy prices that were going to hurt our industries was that you'd have very low energy prices and these businesses would yield no returns and be able to go off and innovate and drive that production and the economy further. So either scenario that was going to pan out under their world, especially with massive government subsidies, was going to be worse than the status quo and actually hinder our ability to continue with Australia's growth. But further from this, what they failed to consider was the opportunity cost here. Because what this topic required, regardless of the semantics debated, is that what it hinged on is that can we actually sustain economic growth without changing that mix? I think they failed to consider something very important here, because when the government actively subsidises things like renewables and sinks the massive investment that we told you was needed and is always admitted is needed, they were unable to engage in other tactics to engage in consistent growth. It meant things like the investment into consumers and the Keynesian economics that drove that prevented Australia from falling into recession during the GFC can't be supported by the government anymore because they have limited capitals to spend. If they are sinking all of their money into the development of renewables, they are not able to sink their money into preventing monopolies from forming or preventing that sort of stimulus spending that was needed to sustain our economic growth. So at their very best, nothing they did was ever going to pay off for at least the next 10 years. In the meantime, we'd have very volatile energy prices and we would have immediate negative effects. Lastly, in my last 10 seconds, climate change. Yes, this is going to impact us in future, but did this mean we needed a significant change right now that would harm us? No, it absolutely did not. Australia is minimal impact in the global stage for this sort of thing. We didn't think this came into this debate. Absolutely, because we actually sustained Australia's growth and we weren't absolutely optimistic and best case scenario about this, negative won this debate.
Look, I'm really sorry. I'm really disappointed about this. I wrote this wonderful speech, truly wonderful speech, but I left it sitting over there. So what I'm going to do instead, I know that particularly some of my colleagues in the affirmative team have a little bit of trouble reading. You have to be patient with them. So I'm actually just going to wander over here for dramatic effect and see if I can explain it to them. So the government should subsidise, which means give a little bit of money and make it cheaper, right? Yeah. Smashed avocado in order to allow young people, that's you, to afford a house. Having run out of things to say over here, I'm going to dramatically walk back to the podium. And hopefully by now I will have given myself long enough to think of something funny or clever to say. But in the event that I don't, I'll just link it to Mario Kart and I'm sure no one will notice. Or Game of Thrones. So look, I mean, it's pretty clear if you're a young person that the fruit market is a bad market to be in. And I think it is absolutely abundantly clear that we are in the middle of an avocado bubble. And to be honest, I mean, I think in some sense it would almost be more important for the government to kind of subsidise houses in order for people to buy avocados, because I can tell you that as a millennial, there is nothing that I love more than brunch. And I tell you what, I honestly think that the only reason, and perhaps I'm starting to sound like a member of the negative team here, the only reason that I don't want to buy a house is because I really do care about brunch. And I tell you what, if they are the priorities of my generation, if that is what young people want to spend their money on, well, I am sick and tired of baby boomers telling me what I should and should not care about. Avocados are a growth industry. avocados, in fact, forget about renewable energy, forget about everything else that has caused the last 26 years of economic growth for Australia. The future is in avocados. And if these fuddy-duddy old people who comment on the Australian can't understand that, well, I'm afraid there's no helping them. So I think I've actually ended up arguing for the negative team here. I'm not going to change that, but I suppose I'll only conclude by saying once again that I think the only sensible path that can be taken is to subsidise smashed avocado in order to allow young people to afford a house. And I figure, again, if I can't construct an argument, reading the topic over and over again should suffice. And if I can fill in most of my time doing that until I get knocked off, well, then that's a debate well spent. Thank you.
While as a #whitegirlTM, it cuts me to my core to say we shouldn't subsidise avocado use, I'd go a step further and say instead of subsidising smashed avocado, we should simply abandon all hopes of ever having houses and all simply live on avocado plants. We should subsidise the creation of avocado farms, because honestly, I would rather be homeless than live without my avocados. The only thing that gives me joy in this world is that bite of that creamy smashed green stuff that I hope is avocado and I'm paying probably $18 for. That's all my money, let's be honest. Mum, please give me more. So the only way to really combat this without sacrificing my love of avocado is for the government to simply turn all of Australia into one giant avocado farm, where I can continually be surrounded by love and happiness and joy, and I can continually engage in my avocado eating while having a home that I'm pretty sure baby boomers will never want to live in, because why give up luxury and that sort of thing. And that's pretty much all I've got to say.
Tom Rosewall from the Victorian Office of the Reserve Bank of Australia. Would you please come up to deliver the final results?
Thanks very much, and thank you for the opportunity to judge this year's debate. I was here along last year and really enjoyed that, so I appreciated the invite to come back. Just a brief comment to the organisers. This, along with other ESSA events I've been involved with, really well run, interesting, engaging, and really a positive for the society. So keep up the good work. So the judges didn't have an easy task. The length of our deliberations indicate, obviously, it was a tough call for us to make tonight. As the supposed neutral judge, I do have a slightly vested interest in tonight's topic. In terms of 26 years of growth and unchanged mix, the bank does forecast activity over the next couple of years, and we implicitly assume no change in the energy mix and have growth running at around 3% for the next couple of years. So in terms of supporting my colleagues at the bank, I was sort of on side with the negative from the outset, but I put that to side naturally as an impartial judge. Just some general observations about the debate tonight and the arguments raised. We thought we're really impressed by both sides of the argument. We thought both teams were really well prepared and structured their arguments well. Ultimately, though, it came down to, I guess, a couple of aspects which do make for a good debate on arguments specifically and on rebuttal. And on those two aspects, we thought ultimately one side had the edge on rebuttal in particular. Without further ado, we gave it with the Melbourne team on the affirmative. So and just to elaborate on a few points that were made there, so strong rebuttal was a sort of a key aspect that we're able to differentiate the two sides slightly, despite. The one aspect of their arguments, which all three judges favoured, was their points about the optimism about the political climate and the opportunity for change there. That was probably a missed opportunity for the negative, given the political climate has been really quite poisonous for those advocating for change, particularly on climate change in this space over almost a decade now. So that was one reflection. Just on the general line of arguments from both sides, all the judges agreed it did quite quickly focus on a specific aspect of energy markets, specifically on electricity and then specifically on renewables. And we thought both sides could have defined energy perhaps a little bit more broadly to talk about other non-fossil related power generation options, and also the impact on gas and oil specifically as a source of energy in Australia. The other task which we had, which was just as difficult as deciding the side that won, was deciding the best individual speaker from tonight's event. Again, a really tough call. The person we selected ultimately we thought was the most or the best prepared, had the really strong grasp of political and market dynamics, and was able to pull together those quite effectively, and made some really good points about time is now for change. Despite the fact he did give a Game of Thrones spoiler, which for those that haven't seen the latest series was a pretty big negative, but ultimately still able to give it on balance to Tom, so a really good effort there. That said, though, all three judges would say, in a great effort from all the individual speakers tonight, really impressive, well researched, well put together, and ultimately a really engaging debate. So thanks very much.
Can the three judges please come up to present the trophy to the Melbourne team? And a round of applause and congratulations to the Melbourne team for becoming the victors of the 2017 annual ESSA debate. On behalf of the Economic Student Society of Australia, I'd like to once again thank our judges, Tom Rosewall, Dr. Paul Jensen, and Dr. Simon Angus for attending our debate this year. And thank you everyone for coming along. And thank you to our sponsor, our Strategy and special thanks to NAB for giving us this venue. And we'd like to give the judges a bit of a gift.